After this seminar that I did last week, one of my colleagues at work pointed me to a writer called Ranciere, who I've never read before. And this particular article was really great, actually. It was about aesthetics. It was about a kind of, well, a closing paragraph on it made reference to to his ambitions, I guess, to the ambition of his project, which was to construct what he called the Poetics of knowledge. And that really struck a chord with me. This idea that knowledge might have a poetics. And I think, in a sense, it relates very directly to some of the other stuff that I've been reading about, particularly the Mark Johnson material on embodied cognition. In one of his pieces of writing, he says something to do with our capacity for knowledge, doesn't use that term, but our capacity for thought is based on our relationship with objects and their manipulation. So in that sense, there's a kind of continuation of Ranciere's thought there, that this poetics of knowledge is an embodied poetics. At least that's the logic that I'm drawing from those two ideas. Where am I going with this? I guess the kind of ground that this is emerging from, really, is to do with a certain approach to poetics and to aesthetics, actually, which is distinct from perhaps 19th century understandings of poetics and aesthetics, in which the aesthetic or the poetic is thought of as something elevated from ordinary lived experience, ordinary communication, ordinary sensory engagement with the world. I think it's probably fair to say that the writings about aesthetics that come out of Kant and come out of Burke and people like that regard the aesthetic as, well, first off, a uniquely human thing, particularly the domain or particularly owned by certain highly refined forms of humans in some cases, in which the aesthetic becomes a kind of an aspirational goal of the aristocracy and the moneyed classes, and it becomes associated with them. I'm really not coming from anything like that. I'm really coming from the opposite end of that idea, in which the poetic and the aesthetic precedes or underlies other forms of human cognition and human conceptualization and human communication. So we have aesthetic experiences and poetic experiences before we're capable of having rational, objective, reasonable human experiences, conscious experiences, that kind of thing. The logic for that comes out of a number of sources. For example, it comes out of the idea, or some of the ideas that Stephen Mithin talks about in Singing Neanderthals, where he kind of postulates that proto-humans, Neanderthals in that particular case, before they could articulate thought in the form of speech, they articulated something in the form of song. So the idea that singing comes first before speaking. There's also an influence from Stanley Fish in one of his essays. Is there a text in this class? He talks about the possible differences between ordinary and non-ordinary language within literature and the aesthetics of literature, and basically comes to the conclusion that there are no formal differences between the language of literature and the language of ordinary speech. And if anything, I think he says, the language that we use in ordinary speech especially rarefied, and especially taken apart, especially taken out of what's normally aesthetic and poetic, and those elements of them which might be seen as poetic are perhaps denied or suppressed. And I think we see that very much within, not just in the distinction that Fish draws between literary language and regular language, but also the distinction between regular language and scientific language. In scientific language, there's a very overt attempt to suppress any form of metaphor, even though, as Stephen Jones and many other people have pointed out, Lakoff and Johnson have pointed out, Lakoff and Nunez have pointed out, science is absolutely full of metaphors. It doesn't make the findings of science any less objective or any less true in some sense. It kind of redefines what objectivity means, and it kind of redefines what truth means in terms of a particular style of poetry, the kind of aesthetic engagement that's being articulated. Finds of the poetry of reality, as Dawkins says. So where am I going with that? So anyway, that's something to do with that underpinning is that understanding what poetic is lies behind this thing called the poetics of knowledge. It's that kind of poetic I'm trying to get to grips with, so that I'm trying to find ways to articulate what this poetics might be, whilst not completely falling into the trap of pretending that my articulation is not in itself a form of poetry. It's that special kind of poetry which aspires towards clarity, transparency, lucidity, the creation of objects, the illusions of permanence, all kinds of things.